course, Russia lost heavily too. There's a story on Stalingrad, which is what is it in peacetime? No, not Leningrad.
Stalingrad is like.
St. Petersburg,
Oh,
isn't
that's
it?
Leningrad.
Huh?
St. Petersburg is Leningrad.
Oh, Leningrad, is it?
Stalingrad was like Volga or something, or
I don't remember.
it's on the Volga River,
Oh, I see.
but I can't remember the name of it.
I don't know either.
But you're right. That was the beginning of the end.
Yeah. Well, it was. If it's the beginning of the end for the Russians too, because the Russians lost thousands and thousands of people on that winter. I don't forget which winter it was. Probably '44, because it was towards the end of Hitler's. But anyhow, not only did Hitler lose so many, but the Russians did too. A miserable, cold winter, and there was nothing. Nobody had anything. The Germans were marching out there and 40 below zero, and no food, that's what I mean. They were so far from their supply source, they couldn't keep supplied. And then furthermore, the circumstances, so much snow and everything else, the roads, they couldn't bring anything through. So the Russians and the winter had a lot to do with knocking Hitler out.
What did you mentioned that the British realized they needed to do something once Hitler had gone into Czechoslovakia and that kind of thing. What did the Americans see at that point? I mean, did Americans just continue to say it's not our war?
Yeah.
I mean, what was the general attitude?
We would read the news and go back to our usual habits. We weren't affected too much with it. Even when Hitler said that, or even when Britain said that. I mean, any thinking people, and there weren't many, not that they were all dunces, but I mean, they just couldn't comprehend anything. This Hitler had a war machine like no one had ever seen before. It was fantastic. He had, and his operation, they had what he called the pincer movement. And what he would do, he would send a body of troops here, and while they're right here, this is the pincer bit. He's got two going clear around and encompassing all of the enemies, and then hitting them from all sides, see. And that was new. I mean, he wouldn't do this just a square mile. I mean, he'd do that on half of France, for example. Just big chunks of land and big chunks of people. And the French were no good at all. They fell on their face right off the bat. And of course, the biggest fallacy of all was the Siegfried Line in Germany and the Maginot Line in France, which were caves cut on their side of the border, on both sides, deep places for cannons, for armament, for ammunition, and for great bodies of troops and everything else. And so the reason for that is they could get to the border, but you couldn't go any further. They'd hold it off. Well, that was France against Germany. But of course the airplane, that changed all that. See, so those two things, they didn't amount to anything. Only a matter of a few months, those lines were broken. And that must have been a big disappointment for the ones that fostered them, because, boy, they put a lot of money and time in building those things in there. They're still there. And it's still with the broken cannons and everything in them. And in fact, when Bonnie and Nancy and I went to Europe over there, we were walking on the beach in France, and or they were. I decided I didn't want to take the walk because I was having my bum leg. I had to stop somewhere, So I found a place to sit down. on the beach, and they took a walk on the beach, and they came back all excited because they'd seen one of these great big block houses down there and busted up cannons and everything else down there, which was a carryover from the Second World War.
Right.
That was when, 1994 we were there. And there's a lot of remembrances such as that all over Europe yet.
You mentioned earlier about how much the news was slanted one way or the other, and so it was hard to know what was really true at the time. You weren't, because, and it was the same in the U.S. I mean, they would have, I know the United States was producing essentially propaganda for the army. What do you remember about those kinds of things and how it changed the way people thought at the time? I'm talking about during World War II.
Yeah, I understand. Well, once we got into the war...
Do you remember the Why We Fight series?
Why We Fight? No, I don't.
Oh. There was a series of like, they were almost like newsreels, but they were longer and they were shown like regular movies, and there was a series of them called Why We Fight, and Capra
different reasons that get us into battle.
Yeah, and they were essentially propaganda films, produced by the U.S. to get people excited about, or keep them motivated about the war.
Well, you see, the motive of the war in the Second World War and the First World War, the motive at the beginning, Hitler's motive in the Second World War, and he is the reason of the Second World War, Hitler. He's the kingpin of the whole shebang. And he was the same as the kingpin in previous shebangs that ended up in war, and that is they wanted something their neighbor had. They wanted resources, they wanted land, they wanted access to the ocean, something that the other guy had they didn't have, they wanted. And that's always been the motive for most wars. When we come, and that was Hitler's motive. But, and the motive to the other people is to protect themselves from this onslaught. Of course, that's all what all wars are. But in the First World War, now I'm going to speak of our part in it, we had that same situation, except when we went in there, we didn't go in there with any motive to take anything, land, people, resources, anything. We went in there because we saw that the status quo of Europe would be changed to the worse instead of the better. And so therefore we went in to moderate the thing, to make the sides even, or to make our side a little stronger so we could win. See, entirely different motive. And that was the same thing in the Second World War. First of all, Japs went in, they wanted the East Indias because it was rich in resources, everything else. And they wanted a place where they could get oil and things like that. Those were their motives. And Hitler's motive is just, he wanted Germany to be über alles, to be over all. And so with that kind of selfish motive, boy, that's what they did. But in both those wars, we came in there and we had no motive. We had no motive such as ever in history. There's never in history, to my knowledge, been a country that put in as much in resources and manpower into a war that only did it to calm the thing down and have it stop. And that's what we did. And that was something new on the horizon. And we still have been playing the same game ever since. I mean, we've had a lot of little brush fires all over the place, but we have never gone in there and won and taken anything. We've gone in there, won, and then backed off. So we're a different breed of country. Thank goodness.
Did what kind of news would you get back during the war in the States about what was going on? Obviously once the United States entered the war, people probably followed the news pretty closely.
Oh yes, they did. So they had their own men over there.
What was the tone of the news, I guess?
Well, you'd be surprised in these days. You'd be surprised how little we had in the way of news and particular pictures. We have, in the recent wars that we've had, even the Second World War, started that way. We've had movie cameras all over the place and everything else, air shots, and very well covered pictorially. And but in the what we didn't have in the Second World War was TV. And so the only pictures we saw, and we didn't have radio. Wait a minute, what am I saying? Yeah, we had radio. We didn't have pictures. So if we wanted pictures, there was only one spot we could get pictures. That's in the movie theater, where they had RKO and Pathé News. You know, with every movie they would have the news. And that was the only pictures we saw of the war. But we got a lot of printed copy and a lot of still pictures in the newspapers and so forth. In comparison with the what's that war we had in the 90s?
The Gulf War.
Gulf War. But they had for every tank they had a TV camera. All over the place. They saw everything that was going on. And so, and most people now, I mean, everything that happens all over the world, bingo, a mountain slides down in Peru or something. Before the thing stopped rolling, we got cameramen all over the place. And so it is all over the world, everything. And so now we wonder, how would it be to not have that news? But back then, we were happy for Pathé News because that's all there was. And but anyhow, I don't know whether I'm answering your question. I lost track.
Well, sounds like you were just about to. I was going to ask you, what was the Pathé News or the RKO pictures and things like that? What was the general sentiment or the tone of those? I mean, did they only talk about the good news, or
No.
Did they talk about the bad things, or did they say the United States only did good things, or would they be critical or anything like that?
I think they played it pretty close to the belly. I think they told it as it was. There's no way of knowing how much was propaganda. I mean, we're sitting in a theater. We take in what we see. We don't know what's behind it, really. But as far as I can remember, there was little doubt that what you saw is what was happening there. Because as far as pictures are concerned, those pictures are actually, I mean, buildings blowing up and everything else. They don't put on an act like that on a wartime. You see the real thing. And of course, the copy, the stories and everything else were very much the same. In the big picture, I mean, in the movements of the war and everything, and in the Oval Office and the other high mucky-mucks places of occupation, there might be things going on. Say, well, look, let's tell the people this. And maybe they were, maybe coloring the truth a little bit. I don't think there are any bald-faced lies, but well, there might have been, but who knows? But I think the news that we got was pretty much true. What they could do they, and probably did, and I wouldn't know this, but I could suspect it, is they couldn't alter a situation, but they could play down a situation. They could make something that really had a great effect on the movement of the war, but if the home folks heard about it, there'd be hell to pay. That they'd play it down. Now that could happen. I could understand that.
Did you at the, I don't know if you can remember back to the time, at the time when you saw those kinds of things, would you process that in your mind that this may not be the complete truth, or did it even matter?
Well, any time that we were hoodwinked, it mattered. I'm trying to think of any instances of where we were hoodwinked. We might have been hoodwinked in this way, where we would go in, let's say, an island in the South Pacific, and Lord knows we lost thousands of men in those islands. But if we were losing too many for the home folks' digestion, I could easily see where they'd say, "Hey, instead of losing 1,500 men on this beach, let's cut it to 500 or something like that." I could see that, because it'd be a little difficult to prove they had lied to us, and we're probably doing it for our benefit anyhow, so we wouldn't feel so bad. But who knows who's doing what to the news and under those circumstances. But I thought we were getting a pretty good scoop.
That's what I said, and that's what I was wondering. I mean, did it even matter that things were, that they paint things in a positive way most of the time?
Well, we didn't know that they were painting in a positive way. We had no comparison. We had no way to prove that they were telling us a fib, or that they were telling us the truth. We just had to take what we got for granted, and in our own mind say, "Hey, that's a lot of eyewash," or say, "Well, it's got to be," No way you could prove it. The newspapers would sometimes editorialize about a given instance or something, and where they would point suspicion towards a certain news release that had happened or something, and get some quotes from some people that made it sound like it's kind of fishy or something. They might have done things like that. But overall, we believed most of what we saw.
What was your remembrance? I remember I asked you this earlier when we talked about World War I. You were young, obviously, very young when that war happened, and when people came back from that war. What was your remembrances about meeting and talking to soldiers and guys who came back from World War II and their experiences and things like that? The ones, like anyone that you talked to personally, or?
Well, like you say, I was very young. I was 6 when the war ended. It ended in 1918. And I was 6, and that's the year my father died of the flu. So I wasn't of the mind to be asking questions about the war. I was still playing with my Tinker toys. But things I do remember is, I remember, besides my father who went into the service, my uncle Hugo was in the service. He was a corporal, I think. But anyhow, he came back. And I don't remember him saying an awful lot about the war, but I remember he was smoking cigarettes, something the tobacco companies started with all the soldiers overseas, give them free cigarettes to get them hooked, He got hooked. He smoked them all his life. But the thing that I remember in those days is Grandma and Gramp bought a big picture book of the First World War, of all the gruesome things. Not real gruesome. They didn't print real gruesome things. You didn't see a man laying there with his arm off or his guts hanging out like they do now. I mean, that's all they're looking for now. But you'd see them dead, laying on the beach, half covered with sand, and various things like that, and busted, twisted tanks, and in mires, and guys with their rifles walking through slush and everything else, and I remember looking at eyes agog at this stuff because, gee, was this? I'd heard about the war, but this was it, you know. And that was an interesting thing to look at, as gruesome as it was. But that's the only thing. And another thing I remember about the First World War was the music. Keep your head down, Fritzy boy, keep your head down, Fritzy boy. Late last night in the pale moonlight, I saw you, I saw you. And I don't remember the rest of it, but anyhow, the idea, an American guy in the trenches is saying, keep your head down, Fritzy boy, I saw you. You know, either keep it down or boom, I'm going to knock it off. That was, and then there was Katie, Katie, da 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 da. Nice, cute tunes. My granddad always sang those things when he was working. He loved to sing those old songs. And what were some of the others? Oh, how you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? Various other things like that. Mickey, pretty Mickey. Well, that's about all I remember. But that ought to be enough.
Well, the reason I was asking you that is then how about after World War II? How was it? I mean, now you're older and you have perspective.
Yeah.
What was it like? I mean, did you talk to people who came back from World War II? Who had
Oh
fought in the
yeah,
war?
yeah.
What was their feeling? I mean, how that kind of thing. What
Well,
was
I'll
your
tell you.
impression? Would you ask them about, you know, how was it back there or things like that? Would you ask? Do you even ask a soldier about how it was when they come?
Well, some of the thing is, the soldiers that came back and really saw desolation and killing and blood didn't talk about it. You couldn't drag it out of them. I had a number of friends like that, and they'd slough it off. It's nothing. You know, they wouldn't talk about it. A lot of them that didn't see so much, they would be a little more mouthy. You know, they'd probably make up half of what they're talking about. So you couldn't get a really, well, you would get a true picture if you believed the guy you were talking to. You got a picture of what it was, but a lot of times, the guys, you know, they would get a little grandeur out of being able to hold a conversation, you know, and by telling about their things, and so sometimes they'd spark it up a little with a little nonsense that really didn't happen.
But you don't. Do you remember any instances of talking to someone personally and them just opening up about it, or that just didn't happen at all?
The only one I remember is Sherwood Marks, a good friend of mine, who came out of the war a colonel in the Signal Corps and in photography. He was a photographer, and I knew him several years before the war. We both worked in the Democrat, the paper there in Davenport, and then he moved to California. And so I got to know him out there too. Renew our friendship. And anyhow, he went into the service. I could have gone into service too, but Lockheed wouldn't let me go. Sherwood, the only thing he told me is that he was on a raid over the Ploiste oil fields. Ploiste oil fields were down there near the Balkans somewhere, I forget where. And it was one of the sources for Germany's oil and gas and everything else. So we sent a big contingent of bombers over there on this one occasion, or maybe more than one occasion, but he tells me about one occasion, what he was on. And what a sight it was at night. This is at night. They're bombing, and everything is peaceful down there, or they always keep their lights off, like we did. We had to do it too, so that the bombers couldn't see there was a city down there. But anyhow, all of the bombers knew where it was. So all of a sudden they started dropping these bombs. And boy, he said, square miles just lit up like a Christmas tree all over the place as these bombs were going off. And we really creamed that place, the oil field. I don't think they ever got a drop of oil out of there after we were through with it. And he saw that. And that's the only thing he would talk about. And he saw other horrible things too, but he wasn't. When you asked me, what did anybody ever say, I was thinking Sherwood Mark, because he opened up more than anyone else did when he told me about this place, Steve. Oh, you would hear some remark made like, boy, this is one hell of a lot better than being in a, what do you call it, digging a hole?
A foxhole?
Foxhole. Or something like that, but that doesn't tell you much. Your imagination say, yeah, that'd be awful. And also about where they'd be in a foxhole and the Japs would be in a foxhole 20 feet away from them, and the Japs would be talking English to them and saying, hey, Joe, you got a match? You got a cigarette? Something like that. If this guy comes out, boom. See? But we pulled our tricks too. So it had to be a ghastly way to live, I'll tell you.
Yeah. Did now you had a couple of young daughters during the war.
Right after the war.
Well, you had.
Oh, I had, yeah, the oldest two were young. Yeah, that's right.
Would you talk to them about the war, or what was happening, or what it meant, or those kinds of things?
I don't think so, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's not the kind of subject matter that interested a young girl. And secondly, the war was behind us. See, Vicki, oh, wait a minute, we're talking about the oldest girls. Well, even then, the same thing proves true. I mean, as young women, they weren't interested in that. I mean, it's a man type thing more than that. And all the people were interested in hearing was what happened over there. Well, how did it do? Gee, what'd you see? And the girls weren't interested in that, because it was all blood and guts. It's if they could come back and tell what the girls were wearing in France or something like that, why the girls would be all interested, or what the boys looked like. But no, I think there was not a lot said to them about it. They probably, over a period of time, picked up some knowledge on their own. Or maybe I did talk to them from time to time, or talked about the war in their presence, where they heard a little of it.
Well, that's neither here nor there. Were you gonna say something?
Well, I'm doing the same thing you are. I'm searching around for something to say.
Oh well, I had a question, and I just it didn't have anything to do with that.
I see.
Well,
You want to take a rest?
Yeah. Do you want to?
I wouldn't mind. I want
get a
to
quick drink.
get a quick drink.
I was just going to ask you.